Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. It's morning here. Welcome to the BEC 213 module, offered in Alice and in East London as BEC 213E. As you can see from the front slide here, the prescribed textbook is by Trevor Amos and his colleagues, Human Resources Management 4th edition. There is a 5th edition in circulation, so this is probably the last time that we're going to use this textbook. I would also urge you to read the textbook and not just rely on the content that we are sharing through these videos and audio files. I would say the best thing is to rather use these as a guideline of what is it that's key to read in the text, and then follow it up with the content in the textbook. So let's get started. These will be brief, short videos to try and assist you to just as you navigate through the prescribed text. So the module is about human resources management, which is one of the business functions that you've probably learned by now. I think equally you will be having a module, operations management, and then subsequently next semester you'll have marketing management. So this particular module is dedicated to understanding those dynamics related to how we manage people in organizations. We'll also link this with aspects related to labor law, which you will see in the subsequent postings to follow. The key thing I think we are driving towards is this notion of a sustainable organization. Now, when we refer to a sustainable organization, we're not talking about it from the point of just being sustainable in terms of environmentally friendly, sustainable practices, but rather it also concerns issues around how do we use the people inside our organizations to achieve this form of sustainability. And this is what the module really tries to get to the core of, looking at dynamics of talent retention, dynamics around how do you manage people inside the organization, how do you get people inside the organization, and ultimately the aim is for sustainability, which is this concept around continuity, not just in terms of financial continuity, but also in terms of the people that are able to make us achieve the goals that we're working towards. At the beginning of each chapter, you will notice that we have circulating outcomes. These will be helpful, particularly in trying to assist you to keep a focus on the issues that are important in the chapter, and those are the learning outcomes that we seek to cover. So if you can, at the end of each chapter, sit and go through each of those outcomes to say, I have done the following, and you can tick, you're able to actually monitor learning in your own space as well, to see what is it that is expected of you, and the learning outcomes will really assist with this process. So let's get straight into it. And the first thing, I've put those in red, we need to talk about are concepts that are often peddled around in society and in community, particularly if you read any business article or newspaper feed, or even on the radio or on TV, you'll hear them talk about some of these things. The first one is the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy has now been actually buttressed by aspects related to the fourth industrial revolution, which is this aspect really focus on understanding the currency that people, technology can have as part of an economy that is reliant on knowledge. Not just knowledge in the term, the knowledge that we in the sense that we know it, but it's also translating this quest for knowledge into ideals that assist organizations to operate optimally and effectually. So you'll actually find that a lot of the countries that are deemed knowledge-based economies will be integrating a lot of technology, automation, robotics, to try and actually position themselves as useful outlets within such an economy. The second thing that you'll often hear about, pick up any strategy book, is this notion of competitive advantage. Competitive advantage really talks to that one thing that we are doing that none of the other players in our market cannot be able to replicate or copy us as we are doing it. So for instance, you can distinctively pick up brands like Coca-Cola, who have made an indelible mark within the industry as dominant leaders in this software drink market, to the extent that every other soft drink, even though it's not a Coca-Cola, is actually branded or framed to be in this quality of the Coke brand. And the competitive advantage talks to how do we use the people in our organization? How do we use the technology in our organization? How do we use what we refer to as the dynamic capability processes within our organization to be distinct so that no one else can be able to copy what we do? This then feeds into this idea of intellectual capital, which is what we're going to talk about next, really, because it's really the ability that employees have to apply and transform their knowledge into understanding something of value. It's about creating this idea of value add for the job and for the organization. We omit an important aspect here, which is for their own personal gain, because it's not just about what they are giving to the job or the organization, it's what they are also able to achieve. And in some of the work I have done in terms of my research, we've looked at the transition of people within the knowledge-based economy, and we actually find that people who move around a lot from one job to the other are those who are exactly within that sphere of high ratings of employability, that they've got certain skill set that allow them to be able to move from one position or one job to the other. Ultimately, all of this creates wealth, not just wealth for the organization, but also wealth in terms of the individual. And that's what intellectual capital is really about. And that fits into the profit service chain, because the profit service chain really is the basis through which business models align themselves to. That we are offering a service in the hope of achieving some form of a profit. But how we do that is also dependent on certain issues. The internal working environment, we can look in fields of industrial psychology where we start talking about things like ergonomics, which looks at the science of space and design, that we cannot expect ourselves to be achieving this profit if the internal working environment that employees are subjected to are not addressed. Then this links to outcomes such as employee satisfaction, loyalty, and productivity, and how they subsequently inform the service. And ultimately, that leads to quality. And quality is not just attained as a once-off attainment, really, but it's a continuous, ongoing process. That's why you'll notice a lot of organizations strive to continuously be improving themselves through quests of quality improvement in the products that they're offering. Customer satisfaction, loyalty, and success. Loyalty here would also refer to how do we keep customers happy. And you'll actually find that sometimes customers need to be also be conscious of what is happening inside the organization to be able to be satisfied around that the products that they are consuming are not produced or made in a way that is exploitative to employees. And so the dynamics really float into each other. Ultimately, we have organizational success, but this is also coming from a position of individual success where employees are continuously finding ways of improving themselves. We can then be petty and try to describe what an organization is. Basically, the most common of those definitions, as you can see, are around a systematic process. And I like the next slide because it then puts it into perspective, because it's about a system that feeds itself through the inputs, a system that feeds itself through outputs, which is what the customer gets in the end. But it's also about the internal dynamics, which are the processes that are happening inside the environment. And as you would have learned in your first year, we've got the micro environment and the macro environment. Right now, we are recording this content largely due to a challenge that has affected the entire world around the COVID-19 pandemic. And this also shows us the interrelatedness or interconnectedness of the world systems that we belong to, and how a single event in China has subsequently affected the entire world and how we learn and how we conduct business. So this is part of this system that we're talking about. We must also ask an important question. What then becomes the criteria for success in organizations? Organizations exist and are driven by a goal in mind. There are things that we can talk about. The first two you've learned in your first year, which are efficiency and effectiveness, which is really about effectiveness, talking about doing the right thing, and efficiency, talking about doing the thing right. So you can look at it this way. You can look at it in the sense of tools. I would love to get to East London from Alice. Okay? But how do I get from East London to Alice? And the answer really is simple. Effectively, I have to do the right thing. Efficiently, I have to do the thing right. So I must weigh options around, do I walk from Alice to East London? That may not be efficient because it's not doing the thing right. I can look at, do I take a bicycle from Alice to East London? Again, that talks around striking a balance between those two concepts of efficiency and effectiveness. One of the things that's also important is the aspect of adaptability. We can look at it from the work of people like Mark Savickas, who's a celebrated guru within the careers literature, who talks about a concept called career adaptability, which is a way of responding to change due to environmental pressures. So as the environment changes, so does that compel the individual to also change. And if the individual is going to change, so must the organization change. So it's part of that input-output process system that we were talking about. Then the idea of congruence or fit, I like to illustrate it through the use of hands. Congruence or fit is really, how do we make it gel? How do we make it blend? And one of the difficult tasks in the modern era is to try and find people that are in the right mindset and associate them with the right brands. It's not always easy because sometimes what you get is a misfit. Remember the congruence factor? You sometimes get a misfit where you don't get the right people, but you've got the good organizations that they're working for, or you've got bad organizations who have employed good people, and subsequently that fit is needed. And finally, as we started off, the issue of sustainability, the issue of responsibility, not just responsibility in terms of the environment, which is where it's been narrowed to, but also responsibility in terms of how we treat those people who work for us. So we can also have stakeholders. We can borrow here from stakeholder theory that the ultimate aim of any entity is to meet the needs of these stakeholders. Some stakeholders are inside. Sometimes you have a board of directors. Sometimes you have stakeholders in the community. In most cases, if we're offering a product to a community, most of our stakeholders will have to be outside the organization. And then this issue of sustainability, which we spoke about, not to be narrowed down to just environmental sustainability, but should talk to also socio-economic issues, realities that people face. Jack Welch, celebrated General Electric CEO, then starts to paint a picture around the role of people in organization. General Electric, a very, very popular company in America, was all about finding and building great people. I like that. Finding and building great people. This is not to say that these people did not have anything to offer and that they were all made by General Electric. But he continues to say, I'm over the top on lots of issues, but none comes as close to the passion I have for making people's General Electric's core competencies. And that's one thing that organizations should be striving for, creating core competencies through the people that work for us. So some people have even gone further to say it's not just about making it a core competence, but a distinctive competence, which really brings into another angle the idea of uniqueness. The most important thing as we build up to this are the elements of intellectual capital. Now, you should be able to identify these elements and explain each and every one of these elements. What I've done on the slide is just to put the 3 elements and a little bit of information. What you need to do is to go to the text and read a bit on each of these elements. Let's look at the elements. The first of these is human capital, which is really an individual level construct that consists of employee capability, satisfaction, and sustainability. We are viewing our people as a capability, which is a distinctive asset that we have that helps us to achieve the values, the goals that we seek to attain. Ultimately, we must pay attention to aspects of satisfaction. Now, this is a fluid concept because sometimes people in organizations are not happy, sometimes they are happy, and sometimes what makes them unhappy are issues that are at the surface, and sometimes there are issues that are out in the open. So continuously, this positions the importance of the human resources unit to be able to monitor those aspects that make people happy or sad within the organization. Sustainability, as we spoke about, is about continuity. We must avoid the idea of people constantly leaving the organization. So we must find ways of keeping people inside the organization. And one of the ways we can do that is through relational capital, which is another form of capital, which is looking at more of creating relationships between stakeholders. And you can use a bit of stakeholder theory here between employees, customers, and the community. We need to pay attention to the community because the community becomes an important asset through which we achieve the goals that we are trying to achieve. We can also talk about structural capital. If you notice, relational talks about relationships between people, but there are also things that we may not be able to touch or we may not be able to see, but are part and parcel of the ongoing processes and discussions that shape organizational dynamics. And this is where structure comes in. There's an age-old debate within the literature as to what comes first. Does the strategy come first, or does the structure come first, or does the structure come first, or does the strategy come first? Ultimately, what structure is really about consists of culture. Some organizational behavior theorists have defined culture as a way of life. This really talks to the ongoing issues that are at a surface and also really entrenched deep within the organization. So the way of life within the organization is culture. Organizational processes and information systems. At the end of the month, how do I know that I am going to get paid? How do I know that the leave system works? And those are processes that must be seen to be operating. Those are part of structural capital. Information systems becomes important because a lot of organizations are now seeing this as a useful benchmark in making sure that we have some form of reliable outlet through which information recording is important. So imagine if organizations did not have record-keeping systems that they have, it would be very difficult to actually function and operate based on this idea that we spoke about of the knowledge economy. And so we also must manage intellectual property within the organization, or what is created within the organization. In previous years, when I've taught this module on this part, we've spoken about the challenges. For instance, using the case of Vodacom, the gentleman who created the Please Call Me facility, the technology that is used by Vodacom, and who actually owns that intellectual capital. And the debate often is what we create as part of our day-to-day jobs, the organization can own it as part of the intellectual capital created during the working hours. However, it also presents other tricky issues around fairness and trying to see people not just as part of end goods in the capitalist system, but to try and see people as also seeking for personal gain in what they do for their own advancement, and hence the need to also recognize the issues that they are to deal with. This is how we manage people effectively, by looking at those aspects of intellectual capital. And I would advise you to go and read more about these, because these form a key part of even the assessment that we ask you around elements of intellectual capital. So let me tell you a little story about as we build into what is human resources management. What you see there is a picture that is often used by people to try and explain what human resources management is all about. A story is told of a rich sultan in India who came in one day riding on an elephant. As he was riding on an elephant, a group of blind men were told that the sultan is riding on an animal that none of you have ever seen, but because they're blind, but we're going to try and assist you to be able to understand what this animal is. And the interesting bit about this scenario is then each of the blind men is then given a chance to feel this elephant, this animal called an elephant. As you can see, one of the men went and touched the tail, another felt the belly, another felt the leg, another felt the tusks, another felt the trunk, and another one felt the flappy ears. At the end, they were all lined up and each asked to describe what an elephant is. So each and every one of the versions was different. However, each and every one of the versions was actually correct, because they really magnify into issues of what an elephant is at the different subcomponents that there are. This then builds up into this idea of human resources management as part of a process, an organizational process. Some call it a function that really concerns the following activities: establishing the roles of employees, linking the aims and the objectives of the organization. And how do we achieve this? Through the efforts of people. People become the primary driving force through which we attain these successes. And this is driven, remember, by the aspects of structural capital, by a vehicle of systems and practices. Stone defines human resources management as the productive use of people, watch the word productive use of people, in achieving an organization's objectives, which are deemed strategic, in other words, have a long-term view, sustainability, and the satisfaction of employee needs. I like this one because employee needs vary. Why do people work? Well, people work for money. Some people work at a time like this, people who are in essential services, they work to provide help to people, and that's more an existential type of reasoning that is linked to aspects not just limited to health, to money, but also to satisfying a utility function in society. The human resources function is really grounded in the idea of a psychological contract. Some of you who are studying industrial psychology will come across this term of a psychological contract. This is really aspects related to inclusiveness, a concern for individual development. And what we observe in the literature is that a psychological contract is really a contract. There are two types of contracts a person experiences. The first one is a signed contract, which is the employment contract of employment, which we'll talk about in the subsequent chapters. But also there's one contract which may not necessarily be signed, but is really an attachment between the individual and the organization. So it's about time frames, it's about how formalized is it, it's about stability, it's about tangible issues that we are seeking to achieve. And ultimately, it really concerns thinking of the other party's best interests in hope that the other party also thinks of your best interests. And that becomes murky because people have got self-serving interests that they may have, which are not necessarily universal or tied to a common understanding. So human resources, as we come to a summation of this part, are an organization's greatest assets. All other resources get connected through human resources. Please note that, not meant through human resources. And the ultimate aim is, how do we properly select, how do we properly train, and how do we properly motivate people to be able to achieve these objectives. We can go further. I align different definitions. Byers and Rue talk about human resources management as part of the effective use of people to achieve organizational, again, individual goals. Remember what Stone spoke about in the first definition we looked at, which is about needs of people coming first. Jussius talks about the field of management, which deals with planning. Remember those activities: planning, organizing, controlling, and how these all align to individual and organizational goals. So in essence, human resources are about acquiring, training, appraising, and compensating people for the right things that they do as part of their individual obligations, and also trying to meet the organizational obligations. If you look at it using the first analogy of a system, it is really a system around the philosophies, which are the mindsets, the policies, which are the driving documented issues that people must adhere to, the programs and practices and decisions, which are really talking to activities and actions that subsequently affect the attitudes, behavior, and the performance of the individual, and ultimately behavior, attitudes, and performance of the organization. However, we must pay attention to not just how satisfied people are, but how they perform their jobs and how they contribute to the organization's achievement of these strategic objectives. This diagram here then tries to position to us an important aspect. What you see out there are the drivers, external drivers that influence the human resources function. And these are the, okay, and these are the inputs, these are the expected outputs, and these are the HR activities and practices that are happening. So later on we will look at, or we can look at it now. You need to know how each and every one of these external factors influence what is happening inside the organization. You need to know how each and every one of these inputs influences what is happening inside the organization. And this is part of this inputs, processes, outputs scenario that we're talking about. Maybe later on we'll be able to look at this. Where can we position human resources management? Please don't see this as set in stone, because it differs with organization to organization. But the general understanding is human resources management is part of a business function. And since it's part of a business function, it works with other business functions like finance, marketing, production. And under human resources management, there are different types of activities, lines that we work with: staffing, HRD, human resources development, labor relations, compensation, and benefits. And this then creates what some in the text have argued to be the new role of business management, of human resources management, which is just moving away from just serving people to actually being a strategic function through which the service of people happens for the entire organization. Okay, so the architecture then is then to understand the idea of HR being a strategic asset. And for you to see this in mind, you need to also understand what is meant by a strategic asset. A strategic asset is any form of unit available to the organization that allows it to be operational on a day-to-day basis, but also think of the future in mind. And then this positions the importance of what you need to know again, the multiple roles of the human resources management function. Now, what we've done as students have struggled sometimes learning these roles, what we've done is played around with an acronym, SM squared and O. The S stands for, one of the roles of the human resources function is to have a strategic long-term focus. The M, the first M, managing people. The second M, managing processes. And finally the O, the operational day-to-day focus. And how this is done, it's done by HR seeking a balance between a range of hats, if you like, the many hats that the HR function wears. The first of these is to be an admin expert. Ideally, this fits in with the operational day-to-day focus, which is to make sure that we are re-engineering the organizational processes to be efficient and to allow for infrastructure to be utilized at the most optimum for the benefit of the organization. The second the hat that they can wear is an employee champion hat, managing employees as valuable assets and providing resources that help to increase commitment and capability. In other words, we also want to reduce turnover. The third hat that an HR person can play here is to be a change agent, which is ultimately an important aspect, which looks at how do we manage or this idea of career adaptability that Mark Savikas talks about. How do we constantly re-engineer and remove and realign ourselves to the happenings in the environment so that we adapt. For instance, we're faced by the corona virus pandemic, so organizations must be coming up with innovative ways of trying to say production must not stop. We must continue working, but we must also allow be sensitive to issues that are affecting our people. So we have a lot of talk around online learning and trying to assist people to work better. We can also look at how do we become a strategic partner? How do we diagnose the organization and align its human resources quests and link this with the overall strategy of the organization? And this talks about this strategic asset that we looked at. Again, this is an important slide, a very common question we like to ask, identifying the multiple roles of the HR function. And really, the issue is to discuss what is on the outside with also what is happening in the inside, the many hats that an HR person wears. So we can also talk about this idea of corporate citizenship behavior, which really looks at how do we make people position themselves and align themselves to see what they are doing to be part of a greater good of not just their own offering, but also aligning themselves with what is happening inside the organization or what the organization is seeking to achieve. To do that, we start talking about what the concept of sustainable human resources management, which looks at capability production, the promotion of the social and environmental health. Remember, we said it's not just about money or the environment, but really a balance between all these things and a sense of connectedness. The text also talks about the constructivist management philosophy of human resources, which really puts people at the center, people as a priority, people as a capability for growth, people as part of a productive work engagement process, people as part of balancing goals. Ultimately, the most important issue is people. Let's end by looking at that slide that we spoke about earlier on, where I said you need to know what is happening outside and how it influences what's happening inside. You need to know what's happening inside and how it influences here for these outcomes here. So what I'm going to illustrate is as an activity is how each and every one of these influence what's happening here. You may remember some of these factors here. The PESTEL, as you call them: political, economic, social, technological, ecological, legal. What you need to show is how do each and every one of these factors influence the human resources management process. So for instance, let's look at the political setup. If there's political instability in a country, it will ultimately affect other things like economic operation, social operation, and the lived experiences of individuals. So political instability ultimately influences how businesses operate. If the environment is favorable politically, the expectation is that organizations will flourish because of this favorable environment. Let's look at the next one: economic policies. If the economic policies are friendly towards business, businesses will use the opportunity to be able to flourish. However, if there is economic hardship, inflation rate is high, challenges around even accessing credit for small businesses to start up, this ultimately influences how small businesses are not only set up, but also how they are run. Social issues, we can look at the challenges of healthcare, the challenges of pandemics, the challenges of violence in society, the challenges of crime in society. All of these can have an impact in how businesses operate. But what we can also look at on the flip side is how some organizations come about as a result of societal challenges. For instance, the security industry is a good responsive type of organization that has emerged due to issues of social instability with a high crime rate. We can look at also the technological aspect if we're talking a lot these days about the fourth industrial revolution. So technology as a capability can be useful in how businesses operate. Each and every one of these functions or activities around human resources management can be influenced by technology. The ecological, which is the environmental issue, I think we can link the current issue we have of COVID-19 here. Due to the challenge we have around the pandemic, you'll actually find all of these activities have to do with connectedness, people interacting with amongst themselves within the organization, outside the organization. So due to challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic, you'll actually find that there's a limited engagement between some of these issues. People are now being told, you don't have to come to the bank. Call and then try and get services over the phone before you deem it necessary to come into the bank. And then finally, the legal environment. We'll look a lot of this later on when we look at the labor law aspect of the module. So in a nutshell, let's go back, as we said earlier on, to those issues that we're talking about, which is the learning outcomes. Next, go and read the textbook. Use this video as a way, an audio as a way of engagement on the issue, and then try and make notes for yourself, and you'll find for each and every one of these there's a little activity that we've put. Each and every one of these chapters is followed by a little activity that we've put that will try and assist you to be able to work effectively in trying to achieve these learning outcomes. I'll see you later on in chapter 2. Bye.